The unforgiving sun beat down on Dan Morrison's parched land, mirroring the relentless pressure he felt in his fight to save the family farm. For 3 grueling years, since the drought began and crop prices plummeted, he'd battled to keep the 400-acre spread in rural Colorado alive. Land that had sustained his family for 4 generations. Yet such heritage meant little to the bank when mortgage payments were 6 months overdue. He was meticulously checking his failing irrigation system that morning, trying to coax every last drop of water from the earth, when he heard an unexpected sound. Voices drifting from the eastern pasture. It was peculiar. The nearest hiking trail lay 5 miles away, and most people adhered strictly to the marked paths through the national forest. Mounting his ATV, Dan drove towards the sound, and what he discovered made him momentarily forget the desperate struggle over water. Huddled in the sparse shade of a scraggly oak tree were 3 figures, 2 women and a man, likely in their 20s or 30s, radiating absolute exhaustion. Their clothes were torn, their faces severely sunburned, and their eyes held the hollow, distant gaze of those who had walked for far too long. Dan pulled up and silenced his engine. "You folks okay?" he inquired, his voice laced with concern. The elder of the 2 women looked up, and even in her disheveled and weary state, she carried a certain poise, hinting at someone accustomed to leadership. "We're lost," she stated simply. "We've been hiking for 2 days, and I believe we took a wrong turn somewhere." 2 days? Dan's gaze fell on their empty water bottles and the way they clung to the meager shade. "When did you last have water?" "Yesterday morning," the man rasped. "We rationed what we had, but—" Dan didn't need to hear more. 2 days under the Colorado sun, without adequate hydration, was a perilous, potentially fatal situation. "My farmhouse is just over that ridge," he urged. "Let's get you some water and food. Then we'll figure out how to get you back to the trail." The relief that washed over their gaunt faces was immediate and profound. Dan helped them onto his ATV, making 2 trips to bring everyone back to the house. His wife Beth was hanging laundry when they arrived, and her immediate reaction was one of nurturing concern. "Good Lord, look at you 3, she exclaimed, ushering them inside. "Dan, get them into the kitchen." For the next hour, Beth bustled around, preparing sandwiches, while Dan provided cool water, sports drinks, and administered basic first aid for their cuts and sunburn. The hikers introduced themselves as Sarah, Mike, and Claire. They explained they had embarked on a 3-day backcountry hike, but had become disoriented on their 2nd day. "We thought we were following the Blue Creek Trail," Sarah clarified. "But obviously we weren't." Dan pulled out a topographical map and pointed out their current location. "The Blue Creek Trail is about 8 miles that way," he explained, tracing a line with his finger. "You've been walking parallel to it, but in the wrong direction." "8 miles?" Mike's face fell, a look of utter devastation replacing his weariness. "We've been walking in circles." "Not circles," Dan corrected gently. "Just the wrong direction. Happens to experienced hikers all the time out here." Claire, who had been largely silent throughout their exchange, finally spoke. "Mr. Morrison, we can't thank you enough. If you hadn't found us—" "You'd have found your way eventually," Dan interjected, though privately he harbored serious doubts. The next reliable water source in the direction they were heading was a harrowing 15 miles away. "What do we owe you for the food and help?" Sarah asked, reaching for her wallet. Dan raised a hand, stopping her. Nothing. You were in trouble and we helped. That's what neighbors do out here. Sarah's gaze swept around the modest farmhouse, taking in the worn furniture and the stack of bills on the kitchen counter that Beth had clearly tried unsuccessfully to hide. Are you sure? She pressed a E. We'd be happy to pay for the food, at least. Positive, Dan affirmed. Beth, can you pack them some extra water and snacks for the hike back? Beth, predictably, was already filling water bottles. And I'm making you sandwiches for the trail, she added firmly. No arguments. Dan loaded the hikers into his pickup truck and drove them to the access road that would lead them back to the Blue Creek Trail. It was a 30-minute drive each way. Time he probably should have spent working on his irrigation system, but he couldn't simply point them in the right direction and hope for the best. Thank you again, Sarah said sincerely as they gathered their packs. You and your wife are lifesavers. Literally. Just be careful out there, Dan replied, a note of genuine concern in his voice, and stick to the marked trails. As Dan drove home, his thoughts lingered on the hikers, hoping they would make it back safely. Beth met him at the door, her expression etched with worry. Dan, while you were gone, someone called about the mortgage. They want to schedule a meeting next week. Dan's stomach plummeted. He had been desperately hoping to buy more time, perhaps to secure enough from the fall harvest to make a payment. But if the bank was calling meetings, it usually signaled the grim reality of foreclosure proceedings. What did you tell them? He asked, his voice tight. That we'd call back. Beth's eyes met his, filled with a desperate question. Dan, what are we going to do? Dan looked out at the fields his great-grandfather had first planted, the sturdy barn his grandfather had built, the very house where his father had been born. I don't know, Beth, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. I honestly don't know. Little did Dan realize that his simple, selfless act of helping 3 lost hikers was about to change everything. The next morning began with another, even more urgent call from the bank. Dan was grappling with a broken pump when his phone rang. Mr. Morrison, this is Janet from First National, the voice on the other end stated. We need to schedule that meeting for this week instead of next. Can you come in Thursday morning? Dan felt the walls of his life closing in around him. Thursday's fine, he managed to say. After he hung up, Dan sank onto the tailgate of his truck, staring out at his failing farm. The corn stood stunted from lack of water. The hayfields were a desolate brown. Even if he somehow managed to make this year's mortgage payment, how many more years could he possibly hold on? He was still lost in his bleak thoughts when a sleek black sedan pulled silently into his driveway. Government plates. Dan's heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Had something happened to the hikers? Were they pressing charges for some obscure reason? A man in a crisp suit emerged from the sedan, an official-looking envelope clutched in his hand. Daniel Morrison? That's me. Dan confirmed, his voice a little shaky. I'm Court Marshal Williams. I have a summons for you to appear before Judge Patricia Henley of the Colorado State Supreme Court. Dan felt as though he'd been punched in the stomach. The Supreme Court? What could he possibly have done to warrant the attention of the state's highest judicial body? What's this about? He managed to ask. I'm just here to deliver the summons. Sir, you're required to appear at the state courthouse in Denver at 10 a.m. this Friday. Dan took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. The official seal of the Colorado Supreme Court was embossed at the top. Inside lay legal language he didn't fully comprehend. But the core message was unmistakably clear. His appearance was mandatory. After the marshal departed, Dan sank onto his front steps, struggling to comprehend the bizarre turn of events. Beth emerged from the house, reading the summons over his shoulder. "Dan, what did you do?" she whispered, her voice laced with fear. "Nothing," he replied, shaking his head. "I helped some hikers yesterday, and today I'm being summoned to the Supreme Court. It makes no sense." Beth was silent for a moment, deep in thought. "You don't think those hikers are pressing charges, do you? Maybe they're saying you held them against their will or something." Dan considered Sarah, Mike, and Claire. They had seemed genuinely grateful for his assistance, but people could be unpredictable, especially once lawyers became involved. Was it truly possible they were suing him, claiming he had somehow endangered them? "I should call a lawyer," Dan murmured, half to himself. "With what money, Dan?" Beth reminded him, her voice strained. "We can barely afford groceries." That night, sleep eluded Dan. He relentlessly replayed his interactions with the hikers, desperately searching for anything he might have said or done that could possibly be construed as wrong. He had helped them, fed them, driven them back to the trail. How could such actions possibly result in a Supreme Court summons? Friday morning arrived far too quickly. Dan donned his only suit, the one he had worn to his father's funeral, and drove the 2 hours to Denver. The Colorado State Supreme Court building was an imposing structure, all gleaming marble columns and formal architecture, clearly designed to emphasize the formidable power of the law. Dan located the correct courtroom and was directed to a seat in the front row. The room was more crowded than he had anticipated, with what appeared to be reporters and photographers lining the back wall. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Henley." Dan rose with everyone else as an imposing woman in judicial robes entered the courtroom. Judge Henley appeared to be in her 60s, with distinguished silver hair and a commanding presence that immediately compelled respect. "Please be seated," Judge Henley instructed. "Mr. Daniel Morrison, please approach the bench." Dan walked forward on unsteady legs, convinced he was about to be charged with something he couldn't possibly understand. But what transpired next left him utterly speechless. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Henley began, her voice resonating through the courtroom, "3 days ago, you provided aid and assistance to 3 hikers who had become lost on your property. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," Dan replied, his voice still uncertain. "And you provided them with water, food, shelter, and transportation back to safety, asking for nothing in return?" Dan was confused by the formal tone, but he answered honestly, "Yes, ma'am. They needed help." Judge Henley smiled, and suddenly her stern demeanor softened, revealing a warmth Dan hadn't expected. "Mr. Morrison," she began, her voice now much gentler, "one of those hikers was my daughter Sarah. She called me Tuesday night to tell me about a farmer who quite possibly saved her life and the lives of her companions." Dan felt his knees go weak, a wave of shock washing over him. The judge's daughter. He had helped the state Supreme Court Chief Justice's daughter. "Your Honor, I didn't know," he stammered. "Of course you didn't," Judge Henley affirmed, her smile widening. "And that's exactly why you're here today." Judge Henley gestured to the crowded courtroom. "Mr. Morrison, what you did represents the best of what it means to be a good neighbor and a good citizen. You saw people in need, and you helped them without question and without expectation of reward." Dan looked around the courtroom, the presence of reporters finally making sense. "Mr. Morrison, by the power vested in me by the state of Colorado, it is my honor to present you with the Governor's Award for Civilian Heroism." An aide approached, carrying a framed certificate and a gleaming medal. Dan accepted them with trembling hands. "Furthermore," Judge Henley continued, her voice strong and clear, "the state of Colorado is pleased to announce that your farm has been selected for the Rural Heritage Preservation Grant. This program provides financial assistance to family farms that represent the agricultural heritage of our state." Another aide handed Dan a sealed envelope. The courtroom fell silent as Dan slowly opened the envelope. He stared, blinked, and stared again. $150,000. The number looked surreal, like it belonged to someone else's life entirely. Dan stared at the check, convinced he was hallucinating. "Your Honor, I can't accept this," he protested, his voice hushed. "I was just helping people." "Mr. Morrison," Judge Henley countered, "that's exactly why you deserve it. The preservation grant is designed to help families like yours continue working the land that's been in their families for generations. According to the county records, your farm has been in the Morrison family since 1924. "Yes, ma'am," Dan confirmed, finding his voice. "My great-grandfather homesteaded it." "Then this grant will ensure it stays in your family for another generation," Judge Henley concluded with a knowing nod. The ceremony continued with speeches from various state officials, all emphasizing the importance of good citizenship and community values. Dan stood through it all in a daze, still clutching the check that would save his farm. Afterward, as the crowd began to disperse, a young woman approached him. It was Sarah, the hiker he had helped, now dressed professionally and looking nothing like the exhausted, disheveled woman he'd found under the oak tree. "Mr. Morrison," Sarah said, a warm smile on her face, "I wanted to thank you again, and to apologize for not telling you who my mother was." "Why would you?" Dan replied, a small smile forming on his lips. "You were lost hikers. I helped because you needed help." Sarah's smile widened. "That's exactly what I told my mother. She said that's how she knew you were someone special." Just then, Judge Henley joined them still wearing her judicial robes. "Mr. Morrison," Judge Henley said, her voice gentle but firm, "I want you to know that this award isn't just symbolic. Sarah told me about your farm, about the bills she saw, about the drought you're fighting. The grant money comes with agricultural extension support to help you implement water conservation techniques and diversify your crops." Dan felt completely overwhelmed. "Your Honor, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll keep being the kind of person who stops to help strangers," Judge Henley replied, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "The world needs more people like you." 6 months later, Dan stood in his newly irrigated fields, watching his best corn crop in 5 years sway gently in the breeze. The preservation grant had been a lifeline, allowing him to drill a deeper well, install highly efficient irrigation systems, and diversify into drought-resistant crops that were, surprisingly, even more profitable than his old corn and hay operation. Beth joined him at the fence line, carrying a pitcher of lemonade. "The county extension agent called," she announced, a smile playing on her lips. "The demonstration plots are performing so well that they want to use our farm as a model for other heritage properties." Dan accepted the lemonade gratefully, the irony of the situation not lost on him. That helping 3 thirsty hikers had ultimately led to solving his own long-standing water problems. "You know what I keep thinking about?" Dan mused. "What's that?" Beth asked. "Judge Henley said that Sarah called her Tuesday night," Dan recounted. "The marshal showed up Wednesday morning with that summons. If I'd known who Sarah was, I might have acted differently, might have been thinking about what I could get out of helping them." Beth nodded understandingly. "But you didn't know. You just helped because they needed help. That's what made it real." A truck was coming up their driveway, kicking up a plume of dust from the gravel road. Dan immediately recognized the vehicle. It was Mike, one of the other hikers he'd helped that fateful day. Mike climbed out of his truck, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Dan, how's the farm?" "Better than it's been in years," Dan replied, a genuine warmth in his voice. "What brings you out this way?" "I wanted to see the place again," Mike explained, "and to give you this." Mike handed Dan a business card. "I'm starting an ecotourism company, and I'd like to partner with you. Agritourism visits, farm-to-table dinners, maybe some overnight camping in your back pastures." Dan looked at the card, then back at Mike. "You want to bring tourists to my farm?" "Dan, you've got 400 acres of beautiful land," Mike enthused. "You're implementing cutting-edge conservation techniques, and you're the kind of person people want to meet. I think we can build something really special here." 6 months after that, Dan was showing a group of curious visitors around his bustling farm, explaining how the new irrigation system had tripled his crop yields while dramatically reducing water usage by half. The agritourism venture had taken off beyond anyone's wildest expectations. "The key," Dan told the attentive group, "is working with the land instead of against it. When we stop trying to force traditional crops to grow in drought conditions and started planting what naturally thrives here, everything changed." After the tour, Dan found Beth in their kitchen, which had been beautifully remodeled with proceeds from the booming tourism business. She was preparing dinner for their guests, a task she had unexpectedly come to love. "Judge Henley called," Beth announced. "She wants to bring a group of state legislators out next month to see the conservation techniques in action." Dan smiled. Judge Henley had become a genuine friend over the past year, often bringing VIP groups to see what she proudly called a perfect example of how government investment in good people creates lasting, positive change. "You know what I learned from all this?" Dan said, looking out at the thriving farm that had so nearly been lost to foreclosure. "What's that?" Beth asked. "Most of the good in this world happens when nobody's keeping score," he mused. "You help someone because they need help, not because you expect something back." Beth nodded in agreement. "And sometimes, when you're not keeping score, the universe keeps score for you." A truck was coming up their driveway, kicking up dust from the gravel road. Dan recognized the vehicle. It was Mike, one of the other hikers he'd helped that day. Mike climbed out of his truck with a big smile. "Dan, how's the farm?" "Better than it's been in years," Dan replied warmly. "What brings you out this way?" "I wanted to see the place again," Mike explained, "and to give you this." Mike handed Dan a business card. I'm starting an ecotourism company, and I'd like to partner with you. Agritourism visits, farm-to-table dinners, maybe some overnight camping in your back pastures. Dan looked at the card, then back at Mike. You want to bring tourists to my farm? Dan, you've got 400 acres of beautiful land, Mike enthused. You're implementing cutting-edge conservation techniques, and you're the kind of person people want to meet. I think we can build something really special here. 6 months after that, Dan was showing a group of visitors around his farm, explaining how the new irrigation system had tripled his crop yields while using half the water. The agritourism venture had taken off beyond anyone's expectations. The key, Dan told the group, is working with the land instead of against it. When we stopped trying to force traditional crops to grow in drought conditions and started planting what naturally thrives here, everything changed. After the tour, Dan found Beth in their kitchen, which had been remodeled with proceeds from the tourism business. She was preparing dinner for their guests, something she discovered she loved doing. Judge Henley called, Beth said. She wants to bring a group of state legislators out next month to see the conservation techniques in action. Dan smiled. Judge Henley had become a friend over the past year, often bringing VIP groups to see what she called a perfect example of how government investment in good people creates lasting positive change. You know what I learned from all this? Dan said, looking out at the thriving farm that had almost been lost to foreclosure. What's that? Beth asked. Most of the good in this world happens when nobody's keeping score, Dan replied. You help someone because they need help, not because you expect something back. Beth nodded. And sometimes, when you're not keeping score, the universe keeps score for you. That evening, Dan walked through his fields as the sun set behind the mountains. The corn was tall and green. The new fruit trees were establishing well, and the guest cabins Mike had helped him build were booked solid through the fall. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Bringing some friends hiking next weekend. Any chance we could stop by the farm for one of Beth's famous dinners? We promise not to get lost this time. Dan texted back, You're always welcome, and bring whoever you want. We've got plenty of water. He'd learned that the most important moments in life often came disguised as ordinary choices. Help strangers, or let someone else deal with it. Share what you have or protect what little you own. Trust that kindness matters or assume it doesn't. Dan had made the right choice on a hot day when 3 exhausted hikers needed water. That choice had saved his farm, changed his life, and shown him that success wasn't about what you achieved for yourself, but about what you made possible for others. The farm that had almost been lost to foreclosure was now thriving, not just as an agricultural operation, but as a symbol of what happened when good people were given the support they needed to succeed. And it all started with 3 strangers who needed help, and a farmer who didn't hesitate to provide it.